Welcome back, everybody, to What Really Matters. I'm Jeremy Stern with you in Los Angeles. I'm here, as always, with Walter Russell Mead of Tablet, the Wall Street Journal, Hudson Institute, and the Hamilton Center at the University of Florida. Let's start with this week's news. First story of the week, and we're recording this on Thursday, February 27th, so things might move fast. But ahead of Volodymyr Zelensky's trip to Washington tomorrow, Friday the 28th, Kyiv agreed to terms with Washington on a minerals deal that Ukrainian officials hope will improve relations with the Trump administration and pave the way for a long-term U.S. security commitment. Ukrainian officials said Kyiv was ready to sign the agreement on jointly developing its mineral resources, including oil and gas, after the White House dropped demands for a right to $500 billion in potential revenue from the deal. Although the text lacks explicit security guarantees, the officials argued that they had negotiated far more favorable terms and depicted the deal as a way of broadening the relationship with the U.S. to shore up Ukraine's prospects after 3 years of war. Walter, news or faux news?
Well, something may happen to firm it up in the next couple of days, but I think at this point we would have to say faux news here, both for very different reasons. Both the Ukrainian government and the Trump administration would like to make it look like something is happening here. From the Trump administration's point of view, we're putting America first, we're getting stuff. We're just really good at this whole negotiating thing. It's all under control. And from the Ukrainian point of view, hey, look, we're engaging with Trump. We're moving forward. We're not going to be left. So both sides want to make this deal look good. But as you noted in your summary, when you start trying to figure out what are the terms, who is getting what and at what price and over what period of time, and it's actually let's just say there's plenty of room for discussion left. So I think we will know more this weekend, but I think it's interesting that the Trump administration doesn't want to make it look as if they are completely writing off Ukraine, whether they see that as a negotiating tactic with Putin, whether they see that as a response to domestic criticism, or whether, that reflects their real kind of core sentiments. We don't know at this point, but it'll be interesting to watch.
Even if the administration was able to get Ukraine to, quote unquote, pay, something in return, do you think a U.S. security commitment to Ukraine, which is what the Ukrainian government is after, is just kind of a non-starter in U.S. domestic politics under Trump, probably, certainly, but even under a Democratic administration? What would that be worth to the Ukrainians?
Well, you use this phrase, security commitment, Jeremy. That means so many things. The Budapest Memorandum was a beautifully crafted security commitment. European troops in Ukraine that are maybe not flagged as NATO, but from NATO countries, and perhaps there's like a U.S. presence in one of the back warehouses or something. Is that a security commitment? What kind of commitment is there? So I think a lot of overheated discussion that we often hear around negotiations of this type is really just people, fanning themselves into a frenzy about words which they themselves do not actually understand. So let's wait and see what's on the table. It's clear that NATO membership is off the table, but let's look at NATO security commitment. Well, Article 5, which is the grand centerpiece of NATO, is actually, I hate to say this, but is kind of wishy-washy. It doesn't say that if another member state of NATO is attacked, the United States must, or any other state must, come to its defense. It says every NATO member must consult its constitutional processes, which is a way of putting in that, a president can ask Congress to make it for a declaration of war, but Congress gets to vote. And Congress refused to ratify a treaty, even at the height of the Cold War, that would ban, sort of require future Congresses to simply follow in lockstep with an administration. So once you start sort of looking under the hood, these like grand phrases like security commitment turn out to be something considerably more evanescent gossamer.
All right, our second story. For decades, social scientists, demographers, and Christians themselves have told a familiar story about the state of Christianity in the United States. The country was rapidly secularizing, the Christian population shrinking on its way to becoming a minority religion. America may have been some years behind Europe in the process, but its pews were steadily emptying. Now, that narrative may be changing, according to the New York Times. After years of decline, the Christian population in the United States has been stable for several years, a shift fueled in part by young adults, according to a major new survey from the Pew Research Center. And the number of religiously unaffiliated Americans, which had grown steadily for years, has also leveled off. Walter, is this news or faux news?
I hate to say it, but it's too soon to tell. A couple of years is not a big deal. I do think that the old grand narrative, Christianity dying out and white people are dying out, the future of America is going to be something completely different. That was a sort of response that, for different reasons, people on both the left and the right were really interested in pumping that story. It's a crappy story. It doesn't make sense. It never really made sense. But all kinds of big policy prescriptions and beliefs about the future of the country, have been grounded in this sort of like over prediction, overhyped bad prediction. So I'm not surprised that we're not seeing this trend go on as people expected. The other thing to think about is that American religion, in contrast to religious identities in much of the world, is sort of less. I say it is transmitted in a somewhat different process. That is, the majority of American Christians who belong to neither to the Catholic Church, Roman Catholic Church, Greek Orthodox Church, or the quote mainline or even just magisterial Reformation churches, the Episcopalians, Anglicans, the Presbyterians, and so on. Those Christians, for one thing, tend to believe in adult baptism, not child baptism, so that you don't, as a Catholic, or as a Jew, you don't become a member of a faith community almost at birth. You actually become a member of that community as a result of a process that you, as a teenager or as an adult, go through. And this tends to mean that you get kind of a cyclical quality to American religious expression. Most of us rebel against our parents. If our parents were a bunch of godless cosmopolites, we want to have like the real faith, the truth in there. And if our parents were like rigid, puritanical, horrible Christian hypocrites, then we want freedom, right? So you have a kind of an oscillation among generations. But what you also have is a kind of an individual developmental path that people who are, in general, people come to religion as adults, even outside of these non-magisterial Christian traditions. You find, I certainly have many Jewish friends who spent, many years not thinking about religion, not coming from religious homes or anything like that. But, marriage and children and things like that come, and people begin to take things a little bit more seriously, start some of these old truths that they used to think were just ridiculous now suddenly have this like sort of new salience for them. And that happens in this kind of Baptist evangelical world as well. And so what we've seen is a combination of very large younger generation. That's beginning the echo of the baby boom or whatever, and plus with immigrants coming in disproportionately young. Then you get the phenomenon of delayed adulthood, so that people now, poor things, are staying in school until they're like 30 or whatever. And so things like marriage and childbearing are coming in at a later age. So that gap of sort of a quasi identity, the prolongation of adolescence cannot mean a delay in religious commitment as well as a delay in these other forms of human commitment. So my sense of it would be that had had something to do with the perceived decline in Christian adherence. We were looking at some demographic and cultural trends, not necessarily directly related to the hold of religion in American life, but just the sort of complex evolution of American society. So, if so, then these new figures, this new sense of a stabilization and maybe at some point an increase in the percentage calling themselves Christian would start to make a bit more sense.
All right, final story of the week. In German federal elections on Sunday, voters delivered a decisive rebuke to the incumbent ruling coalition led by the Social Democratic Party. The center-right Christian Democrats won the largest share of votes, almost 29%, while the populist nationalist AfD finished in second with almost 21%, double the party's share from 2021. The SPD earned a little more than 16% of the vote, the party's worst result since 1887, when it was subject to official repression under anti-socialist laws. Walter, news or faux news?
I think it's not news yet. For when Merz is a more conservative Christian Democrat than the last Chancellor Merkel, but he is going to have to form a coalition, and the coalition is likely to be with the SPD. So you have, which is the same kind of coalition that's been on and off running Germany since the 1960s. So in that sense, boy, a lot of excitement, a lot of people running around with their hair on fire, screaming. And now what we get is a German government that in many ways is indistinguishable from almost all of its predecessors. The weird thing about the last government was that the CDU wasn't in it. So, how different will it be? Merz has a lot of ideas that he's bringing to the table, but how free a hand is he going to have, say, to increase defense spending with the SPD saying, "Wait a minute." And again, my guess is on the concept of increasing defense spending. You might get the Greens on your side, but the SPD is not going to go for a lot, especially if it involves cutting social welfare payments. And I'm pretty sure the AfD is going to want nothing to do with it. And by the way, for people who are talking about the AfD as Nazis, a pacifist Nazi party that doesn't want a big defense budget is a little bit different from what we saw in Germany in the 1920s and 30s, and that is worth thinking about. Pacifist Nazis are not the same as aggressive Nazis. Maybe there's some other points of difference between the AfD and the original Nazi party. What's obviously there's a long-term trend here, which is that the SPD, CDU, CSU grand coalition, which used to be able to sort of count on kind of 60% of the voters, is in bad shape. You got to bring them both together now to get a majority. And that's been going on for a very long time. So I would say the German election is not really news. Also, that everybody's going, oh my goodness, the AfD, it was a big victory for Merz. Christian Democrats came under 30%. Technically, I think you have to call that a defeat. It's just the SPD did worse. So nobody won that election. There's no mandate for real change. Germany as a society knows, at least some of them know they're in trouble, but I don't see any consensus yet on what to do or where to go. So the result of the election, more of the same. That was almost certainly going to be the outcome of the election. So faux news.
What do you make of Elon Musk and maybe to a slightly lesser extent, Vice President Vance's kind of open endorsement of the AfD and what I know the Germans consider interference in their domestic politics, particularly their laws around freedom of speech? What's your read on what Musk and Vance kind of think they're doing here?
Well, first of all, let me just say that to the Germans, just shut up. In the sense, that what German politicians have never like criticized American policies, laws, or politicians. Excuse me, we get nonstop criticism from people at every level of German life, whether it's gun laws, refugees. I mean, everything from the right and the left, let me say. And so to get like, oh my goodness, a foreigner is saying something bad about my party, it's just ridiculous. Just stop. Grow up. All right. Now, to be fair, okay, many of these people aren't being naive fools like I was just caricaturing. They're devious political manipulators who think that by saying, "Oh my goodness, Musk is attacking me," they can like womp up their own vote. So fine, some of them are knaves, some of them are fools. Okay. But it doesn't mean anything. There is, and we've seen it in Canada too, a real popular backlash in other countries against this America First thing. That what that means, among other things, is that unscrupulous, ambitious politicians now find it more and more useful to play an anti-American card, do anti-American rhetoric. I very much hope that some of our folks in Washington will take a look at that and think, did we really want to, so do we really want to help the parties that want to make trouble for us overseas? So that's something I think the Trump administration needs to think about. But I think right now they're having more fun showing their own voters how little they care for all the kind of careful consensus politics and diplomacy that for so long was a fundamental building block of the American approach to particularly Europe.
All right, that does it for this week's news. Let's have the big conversation. So in previous episodes, Walter, we've talked about how Trump in his first term, and also from what we've seen in his second, many of his policies taken together are actually quite hostile to Russia. His focus on energy production in particular that drives down petroleum revenue for the Kremlin is not exactly what you'd expect from a Russian stooge, as you've explained. But this week you wrote about something else that's gotten lost in hand-wringing about Trump's Russia policy, which is that, at least with regards to his kind of diplomatic approach to the Russian government, Trump is squarely in the mainstream that we'd ascribe to Angela Merkel, Barack Obama, George W. Bush, Gerhard Schroeder, Joe Biden, which is to kind of park various legacy conflicts with Russia to focus on mutually beneficial economic links and maybe also personal links. So I'll start off by asking, insofar as this continues to be Trump's approach, do you think he has a chance to succeed where all the others failed here? Or is there something structural to the repeated failures of Western leaders to approach Putin in this way?
I think, time will tell, obviously, but I think the odds against a sort of breakthrough in a real breakthrough in U.S.-Russia relations are significantly lower than the Trump people think. Now, I'll say that their method is actually smarter than Biden's, not prettier, but smarter. And as I write in the column, the Biden people wanted to park Russia, as they put it, but they also wanted to have nonstop attacks on Putin, on Russia. They wanted to say all the ugly things about the Ukraine war that one can actually say, and with justification. But as I say in the column, if you want somebody to park their car on your street, don't throw dog poop at their car. Stand here while we throw mud at you and tell you how terrible you are and applaud the ICC for indicting you, right? But let's have a reasonable arrangement of our business connections. I think if I were Russian, I would see that as stupid and insulting, and it would increase my contempt for you. It would make me think you don't understand how politics work. You have no idea how to approach me, and you're such a bad calculator of power. and such a bad sort of operator in the world of power that someone like Machiavelli would have nothing but contempt for you. And you're probably like really terrible at things, and I can basically push you around. That's the message. They didn't think they were sending this message. In some ways, it's a little bit like Jimmy Carter, who thought that what he could do he came into power wanting to reduce Soviet US tensions. He might have been the first president who thought maybe it's time to get past this whole Cold War thing. But at the same time, he wanted to be true to his deeply beloved ideals of human rights and all of these wonderful things that he did believe in. But what he did not understand is that for the Soviet Union, his human rights aggressiveness and his support for Soviet dissidents and all the things that went there was a message to them that he was not interested in continuing the policies of détente. And for them, there were connections between that and arms control. He wanted to be able to insult the Soviet Union right and left, do everything he could to undermine its legitimacy at home and abroad, but also reach stable statesman-like arms negotiations agreements. So I think there's a lot of that thing, and I don't think Carter or his people knew. In fact, I'm pretty confident they didn't, because I was at a conference of Russian and American officials at that time where the Carter people were incredibly surprised to discover how the Soviets had interpreted their own actions. So, in that sense, Trump is saying, look, if we're going to cut a deal with Russia, let's cut a deal with Russia. Let's stop criticizing them. Let's do all of this. And if the Russian goal here is to cut a deal, okay, that is a more hopeful approach. In some ways, that was what Nixon and Kissinger were also trying to do, sort of take the ideology out of the relationship to build it on. But for the sort of Western political class that has been, serially mismanaging our Russia policy and much else for the last 30 years, throwing the dog poop is the most moral, noble thing they do. That's the test. Are you a good person? If you're a good person, you throw dog poop at the bad people. You don't throw dog poop. You obviously like the bad people and you're a bad person. You're a bad human being. But it's also in your heart of hearts, you know Putin's bad. In your heart of hearts, you also know you just don't have it in you to really fight him. Might be because of China, might be because you just don't believe in fighting, whatever your reason are, you just don't have it in you. All right. So you throw the dog poop less to say something to Putin than to say something to yourself. Again, we've talked about this before. Yes, I know I have the policy of Neville Chamberlain, but I want to be Churchill. I want people to think of me as Churchill. I want to be strong, even though I am weak, but I want everyone, including me, to think I'm strong. So I'm going to throw dog poop at Putin's car. And I think that actually, I hate to say it, but I think that actually has been like a controlling force in Western policy toward Russia. Is the reality. We don't want to confront. The last thing we want to do is spend a lot of time and energy and money containing Russia, dealing systematically with Russian influence, whether it's in Georgia, in Belarus, which they basically took over while we were asleep, Georgia, where the takeovers advanced, the Wagner Group and everything. We just don't want to mess with that. We want to fix potholes at home, whatever. Okay, fine. But you can't be that and also be Churchill on the barricades of freedom. But we're Americans. We don't believe in choosing. We live in a consumer society where you can have everything. You can have the pleasures of vice and yet the reputation for virtue. And I think that's a generational cultural problem that we see in the West. And it has led, I think, to really a disastrous record in terms of our Russia policy. Now, Trump, at one level, we have to say that Trump is at a higher point of clarity about Russia than some of these other folks. But then the question is, how high is that peak that he's reached? You know, does Putin want a deal with the West? And I am just not quite so sure that he does.
Just one more question. Speaking of Nixon and Kissinger, since the war in Ukraine started, I think it's been kind of popular in DC or in the US for people to call for trying to drive a wedge between China and Russia, kind of finding ways to peel them away from each other or get Washington closer to each than they are to each other, a la Nixon and Kissinger. Do you think something like that's even in the cards, or is that just like a total pipe dream?
Remember, there was that wonderful phrase back in the W administration, Mayberry Machiavellis, or, sort of neophyte hicks who thought they were super sophisticated foreign policy operators. Okay. Any Mayberry Machiavelli is going to realize that peeling Russia away from China would be good for the United States. Yes, it would be. It'd be fantastic. But how do you peel? Can you peel? Why would they want to be peeled? You have to want to be peeled. Now, at the time that Nixon and Kissinger were in business,
They were shooting at each other.
yeah, they'd been fighting tank battles on the Ussuri River. And that was kind of, there were a lot of clues that they weren't getting along. They were having huge doctrinal fights over who was the true leader of communism. They were like contesting in liberation movements all over the world between Soviet leaning factions and China leaning factions of communism, et cetera, et cetera. There were more than a few hints. There is nothing like that now. Nothing. It's true that Putin is sort of making quiet trouble for Russia with his North Korea policy, and in other ways, sort of it's clear that this is not a deep love match. But it's also clear that the forces binding them together are stronger than forces that could pull them apart. And if we look at, what do they gain by sticking together? Russia gains the ability to basically humiliate the West over the Ukraine war, which the West was sure it was going to bankrupt Putin and so on. Well, we failed. And he enjoys that. And he's glad that it happened. And he knows that it was because of China that it happened. And so is he going to try to? Trump has got, only 4 years left. What's coming after Trump? What would induce Putin to move his bets from Beijing to Washington? Well, at most, the word of Donald Trump. But Donald Trump is not in a position to tell Putin who wins that election in 4 years. So there's that. But there's also sort of on a deeper level, who is Russia more worried about? Which seems like the greater threat, China or the United States or the West? And I think for Putin, it still looks as if China is less threatening to his power. China needs allies. It needs him as an ally. It doesn't really want to have a sort of hostile Russia that would divide its attention from what it's doing in Taiwan, which means that it's kind of willing to pay. Then if you think too that most of China's population and resources are in the coastal areas pointing away from Russia. So that even though China is geographically closer and shares a border with Russia, in some ways the sense of threat around China's growth and capability and military agenda is much stronger, sort of Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, Vietnam, American connections than it is for Russia. So this idea that a few hectares in Ukraine, a few nice words at the Security Council can pull Putin over to Trump away from Trump, it's optimistic. Let's just put it that way. And we Americans are characteristically a very optimistic people. And sometimes our optimism is justified. We'll have to wait and see. But I think hoping for some kind of lasting understanding with Russia that keeps Russia out of the China camp and enables us to sort of reshift the balance of power in the world at a very low cost. I understand why people would want to do it. I wish I had a better idea of how you could accomplish it.
All right, that does it for the big conversation. Let's end on the tip of the week. Another reader request this week, Walter, this time from Jonathan in Taipei. I think this is our first reader request from Taipei, who wants to know, quote, who's your favorite East Asian novelist or writer, dead or alive?
I guess I would, probably Mishima, the Japanese novelist. He really, and he's very dead. He's very dead in a very picturesque way. I remember once back in the 80s, I met Shintaro Ishihara, who was, later became mayor of Tokyo, was a big nationalist figure. And he as a young man had been kind of in Mishima's circle. And I just remember being fascinated by those tales and also thinking, whoa, and this guy is a leading political figure in Japan. This country is complicated. But Mishima, I think, he was somebody who had an amazingly deep education in Western culture and was able to sort of use a form like the novel in a really deft way that only very deep literacy, I think, could give you. But at the same time, obviously, his meditation was grounded in his sense of Japanese and Asian identity as being something different from, impacted by, and in some ways in revolt against Western influence. So I find that the sort of various levels of reflection in his books are just, for me, very evocative and really help me see things more deeply. I mean, there's certainly other East Asian books that I enjoy. What is it? The Story of the Stone, that sort of 18th century Chinese novel is really terrific. Tale of the Genji, these older ones I like. I think Hajin, the Chinese, I guess Chinese American now we would say, writer, Betty Bao Lord. There are a lot of great novels out there, but I would say I'd start with Mishima if I was looking for a place to begin.
All right, there you have it. Thanks to our producer, Noam Bloom. Thanks to Will Cummings at Hudson and my co-host, Walter Russell Mead. I'm Jeremy Stern. We'll see you next week. And until then, please go rate and review us. This helps other people find the show.